Okay, so what I'd like to do now, there's been a whole bunch of videos embedded in the earlier parts of the lecture that go through an actual skull, point out the different parts. And so what I'd like to do now is just make sure you can summarize and kind of put all of these pieces together into enough of a coherent picture. So what I'd like to do now is to help you go through and fill out your notes. I would remind you in your notes section you do have this part here that really lists out the terms that are most important for the lab practical. I point out that what's going on here is that it lists the skull, okay, here are the bones with the surface features, so each number, okay, is going to be the bone, and then here are the surface features that you need to know in the bullet points. And so that's the pattern that's been followed for all of the skull bones. And then you notice here it changes to vertebral column and thoracic cage. Okay, it lists these terms. Often I get a question about, well, do I need to know the vertebra? Make sure you look at each of these bullet points. It tells you need to know the number of each type of vertebra, which ones are fused. You need to distinguish between them, which means you need to know all those surface features. And then the same thing here for the ribs. You need to know the numbers of each of these ribs and distinguish between the types of ribs. So don't forget these bullet points. I have a lot of students that have asked me that in the past and may have just missed those. So make sure you look for them. So what I'd like to do start with is to get some of these general functions and make sure that you're thinking about them correctly. And so we'll start with some of these general functions of the axial skeleton. Okay, it's going to support, means it provides some sort of internal structure too, gives it shape, and also protects. That's protects from impact. Okay, the following structures: the brain, spinal cord, the thoracic and abdominal organs. Okay. We're going to have it be attachment for muscles, okay, and that's going to be the same for 2, 3, and 4. So muscles that adjust the head, neck, and trunk position. Okay, it's going to be attachment for muscles that perform the respiratory movements, and this is all straight from your book. It's going to be an attachment for muscles that stabilize and position the appendicular skeleton. So these are some of the general functions. Now, what I would suggest that you now do is you think about what are the bones that are associated with each of these regions. So to do, first what I do is I start off with cranium, and there's actually a very good, let me see, image in your textbook here, okay, on page 212. And the cranium is going to be anything that is touching the brain, and the face is everything else. So if it's considered cranium, then it's not face. Okay, so what I do is I first look at, okay, what any bone here that would be part of making up this cranial cavity. And so as you go through here, you should have, in the cranium, you should have the sphenoid bone, the temporal bone, and it asks you right here, are they single or paired? Well, temporal is paired, sphenoid is not. Okay. Occipital, parietal, that is also paired. Occipital is not. The frontal bone and the ethmoid bone. So those are going to be the different bones, and every other bone that's part of the skull that's not listed here is part of the face. And I'll let you go through and see if you can pick those out on the image yourself. Okay. Basically, for the face, we're going to have specific functions. We're going to have it be an attachment for muscles of facial expression and mastication. That's chewing. Okay. For the cranium, this is going to give support and stabilize the position of the brain. And it's also going to be an attachment for muscles that move the eyes, jaw, and head. Okay, so these are going to be the functions of the cranium. Okay. Now orbit, again, a great image in your textbook is going to be found right here, and so the orbit is going to be commonly thought of as your eye socket. Okay, and so you would list any of the bones that you see there. The one that is commonly missed is the palatine bone. That bone is right there in yellow, so it is a little one that sticks up as a part of that orbit. Okay, so I would suggest that you list all of the bones there. You should have 7 of them, so that is my hint. So try listing them, and if you cannot find them, email your instructor to make sure that you have them. Basically, the function of the orbit is no surprise. It's to protect the organs of vision, which is the eyes. Okay, the nasal cavity is to protect the organs of olfaction. It's also, another function of it is going to help warm and humidify inhaled air. Okay, so that's going to be another function of that. And again, there's a couple of images that I would suggest for the nasal cavity. This image is good, and it's going to get you some of those bones, but actually on this next page is really going to help you get all of the bones of the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity is all of this, all back here. So that's going to include bones that you may not initially think of when you view it just from the front. Okay. And there should be, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different bone names listed for the nasal cavity. Okay. The other axial bones that I want to make sure that you get are going to be the hyoid, okay, and then also the auditory ossicles. Okay. The hyoid bone, that's going to be attachment for muscles that position the pharynx. That's going to be the larynx, which is commonly called your voice box. The pharynx is more that back portion of your throat. And they're also going to be muscles that help position and move the tongue. They're going to attach to that hyoid bone. The auditory ossicles, those are the ones that are involved in hearing. When sound waves come in your ears, auditory ossicles vibrate, and that helps transmit a signal to your brain that tells you you've heard something, that a sound wave is coming. Okay. So these are some of the different things that I want you to make sure you get here on that first portion. Now, I believe that the videos went through the sutures, and so you should be able to figure out which suture does which, what bones it joins. I'll do the first one with you just to give you a little bit of heads up. So the first one was the coronal suture. If we look, the coronal suture goes right across here, and you can see on one side is the frontal bone, and on the other side is the parietal bone. So that would be what I would enter here. It's joining the frontal bone and the parietal bones. Okay, and so see if you can do that for each of these other sutures. Again, feel free to go back and look at the videos if you need help with that. So it's really important. There's all these holes in the skull, and we've learned the names of all of these holes. And so it's actually important to know what's going through the hole. The hole is there for a reason, because it's generally letting blood vessels or nerves go through it. Again, if you look on these pages, page 211, okay, and then I believe that there is another page on 212 and 213, but you'll notice it lists these holes: the supraorbital foramen, the optic canal, the superior orbital fissure, and it's going to list the things that are going through each of these holes, okay. What I would suggest, if you go here and it says something like the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve, we haven't really talked about how the trigeminal nerve branches. We just talked about generally the trigeminal nerve. So just know trigeminal nerve. And there's specific ones that I want to make sure that you know. So the cribriform plate that has those little holes in the top of the skull, that's going to have the olfactory nerves in it. The foramen magnum, that's really the place where the medulla oblongata meets the spinal cord. So above the foramen magnum is going to be medulla oblongata, below it is spinal cord, okay? The foramen ovale, I definitely want you to know that the trigeminal nerve goes through that, and a branch of the trigeminal nerve also goes through the foramen rotundum. Hypoglossal canal, well, that one's pretty easy. The hypoglossal nerve goes through it. Stylomastoid foramen, facial nerve is going through that. Optic foramen, optic nerve. External acoustic meatus, sound waves are coming in. The ear then converts that to an electrical impulse, and that electrical impulse travels up the vestibulocochlear nerve all the way to the brain. The transverse foramen that are only found in the cervical vertebra in your neck, that is going to have vertebral arteries and veins, okay? And the vertebral foramen is going to have the spinal cord going down. The superior orbital fissure, that's going to have all the nerves that help move the eyeball. So the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerve are all going to be going through that big slit in the eye socket. So these are some of the ones that I definitely want you to be sure and know, but feel free to look through those pages in the book that I showed you and further fill in those. A few other things you should know: the brain structure that is enclosed by the sella turcica, that's going to be the pituitary gland. It sits right in that saddle, okay? So the other thing we were talking about was fontanelles. If you go to your homework, I believe on page 4, this is talking about these connective tissue sheets where the skull bones have not yet fully replaced that dense connective tissue. And so the fontanelles are those areas in between the skull bones that are still that softer, fibrous connective tissue. Okay, so these are only found, fontanelles are only found between the bones of the skull. And generally, they're going to become fully made into bone at about 1.5 to 2 years of age. So this one particularly is that called the baby's soft spot on its head. Okay. One thing I'd like for you to go ahead and start thinking about is, how do the bones go together? This will help you. We'll do this even more extensively in the joint section. Okay. But start thinking about the jaw. Okay. What are the two bones that are connecting there? And you can actually see that really well if we look here on page 210. Okay, and here's the jaw right here. So we can see that what is connecting is going to be connecting the temporal bone to the mandible. And so I'd like you to think not only the bones, but then also think what are the specific parts. And hopefully you should know after going through the videos that this is the mandibular condyle, or some texts call it the condylar process, and that it sits in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, which we can see the mandibular fossa right in this area. Okay, yes, here we go, mandibular fossa right there. Okay, and so what I would be wanting you to put here is that you could put, it's the mandible is the bone, and particularly the mandibular condyle, or you could put condylar process, and that's connecting to the temporal bone, and particularly the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. Okay, and so my suggestion is to continue to go through here, see if you can figure out for the next ones what are not only the bones, but also the surface features that connect to each other. Another thing is I want you to know some things that you can actually feel through the skin. So for example, this angled bump in between the eyes, that is on the frontal bone, and specifically the surface feature is the glabella. Okay, and so I want you again to think edges of the teeth, where they enter the jaw, so right in there. What is that bone? What is that surface feature called? The bump on this back part of the head. Okay, so think about, again, what's the bone? What's the surface feature that you're actually feeling? The back edge of the jaw, what's the bone? What's the surface feature? Okay. All right, we have a couple of other things here. Sinuses, those are some of the hollow holes, cavities up inside your bones. They do connect with the nasal cavity. And so what do? Well, because they're hollowed out portions, they help lighten the skull. That makes it easier for you to hold your head up so it's not quite so heavy, so your muscles don't have to work quite as hard. Okay, and they're actually lined with mucous membranes, so they're going to send mucus to the nasal cavity. Okay, mucus is important for trapping foreign objects, debris. It also helps warm and humidify air that you breathe in before it goes down into the lungs. If that air is too cold, then it can damage some of the lung tissue, and also by humidifying it, it prevents loss of water from that delicate lung tissue. Another thing that it's going to do is it serves as a resonance chamber. So that's what helps give your voice the quality that it does. And often that's actually why children sound a little bit different. Their voice has a different resonance to it because the skull is not fully formed and the sinuses are not fully formed into their adult locations. And so those sinuses don't act quite as much as a resonance chamber in children. Okay, we already talked about the function of the hyoid bone, about the function of the auditory ossicles, so look through that part earlier. Okay, so the vertebral column. So some different functions, and again, this is straight from your book. Okay, it is going to bear the weight of the head, the neck, and the trunk, and transfer that weight to the lower limbs. Okay, so everything, all of that weight goes down that column. That's what's holding it up, and eventually it sends it down to the legs. Not surprisingly, it helps protect the spinal cord. Okay, and the other thing too is it helps me be upright. Okay, so it maintains an upright body position. Okay. Now this is just cervical is the most superior. location within the column. The coccyx is the most inferior position, and then these are listed in order from superior all the way to inferior. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 coccygeal. Are the vertebrae fused? No, that means they're individual. So for cervical, thoracic, and lumbar, but for the sacrum and for the coccyx, okay, yes, they are definitely fused. And just briefly, okay, I would like to show you what that means. So in your book on page 231, if it's individual, that means this would be an example of an individual. It can exist on its own, okay? Whereas the sacrum and the coccyx, they are fused. Again, so this is individual, individual. Here you can see individual. They have these intervertebral discs separating them. But the sacrum and coccyx are fused, meaning the bones have actually fused together. So in development, they start out individual. This would be an individual bone, but throughout development, they fuse together so that it ends up being one fused bone. Okay. Another thing to talk about with primary and secondary curvatures, and let me get to that. So a good place on your book for that will be page 227. Okay, and so this is where it tells you about your spinal curvatures, okay? So if it's a primary curvature, so for example, the thoracic curve, so you notice it curves like this, you're born with that, okay? Another one that's a primary curvature that you're born with is the sacral curve here, okay? However, others you gain over time as you start putting weight on this column. So those that are gained over time are called secondary curves. So here's a secondary curve in the cervical and in the lumbar region. And it tells you exactly why you develop these curves here. First, the cervical curve, as you learn to sit up and balance that weight of the head, it puts weight on this column and that causes it to curve. And then over here, as you learn to stand, you get this lumbar curve down here, okay? And so these are how the curves form and which curves they are. Okay, so the next thing is the clues for identifying atlas, which is the first cervical vertebra, as well as axis, which is the second cervical vertebra. And let me see where some good pictures of that are. So probably page 230 is going to be the best pictures of those. Okay, so this is showing atlas on top and axis underneath. Axis is pretty easy. It's got this dens, also called the odontoid process, and it's this thing that sticks up right where you would expect the body to be. And so that's going to be the really key feature for identifying C2 or axis. Atlas is the one that the skull sits on top of it. And if you remember in mythology, Atlas was a mythological figure that balanced the skull on its head, or balanced the world on his shoulders. And so if you think of that, Atlas is balancing the world, your head, on top of it. The big things that I look for here for C1 is, one, instead of having a large spinous process, okay, it's going to have just a posterior tubercle actually. And then right here and here, it's going to have these very large places for the skull to sit on, and those are called the lateral masses. So you don't see normal vertebra don't have something that's that large in this region for the skull to sit on. Okay, so C1 is lateral masses and not a spinous process, but instead a posterior tubercle. C2 has this odontoid process or dens sticking up that makes it unique. Okay. All right, and what I would suggest that you do is go through the videos, look and see if each of these big things are listed as you go through the videos. They should be in some cases, not in others. And from that come up with some rules for identifying each vertebra. So for example, if you look here at the transverse foramen, you've got it in cervical, but you don't have it in thoracic or lumbar. So if you see transverse foramen, and I believe there's a picture right up here, so these holes right here along the sides, if you've got that, then you immediately know that you're dealing with cervical vertebra. Okay. And so I go through there, look at those rules for that. Okay. So the parts that now we'll move on to the thoracic cage, which is the in this region. Okay. And that's going to be made up of the ribs, the sternum, also called your breastbone. Okay. Make sure you call it sternum on the practical. Breastbone is more of a common name. And then the thoracic vertebra. Okay, so functions of this cage, it's going to protect things, protection from impact, and the following things will be protected from impact. So the heart, the lungs, the thymus, the thoracic cavity structures, so other thoracic cavity structures, a lot of your large vessels coming off the heart, there's some lymph nodes, different things like that in there. It's a pretty busy region in the thoracic cage. Okay, and the other thing it's going to do is its attachment for muscles of respiration, that position the vertebral column, and that move the upper and lower limbs. Okay, so the thoracic cage does all of these different things. Okay. So if we look at the ribs next, okay, so true ribs are going to be the first 7, so 1 through 7. False ribs are going to be ribs 8 through 12, and then floating ribs are 11 and 12. So ribs 11 and 12 are false, but they're also floating. So what makes the difference here? So true ribs mean that they have an individual costal cartilage that runs from the rib to the sternum. Okay, and the false ribs are going to have one of two things happen. They're either going to have a costal cartilage that connects to the cartilage of C7, so they don't have an individual cartilage that takes directly from that rib to the sternum. Okay, or no costal cartilage. Okay, and ribs 11 and 12 are the ones that have no costal cartilage. Okay, so they just kind of float there on their own. And so those are going to be the ribs. So I believe that this should take you through the axial skeleton. And again, don't forget about these things. Don't forget about the other videos that are available through the earlier parts to help you learn these different bones, to learn these different surface features and where they are located. Please definitely feel free to email your instructor with any questions.